It was cold, and she couldn't move. So cold that seemed to have frozen time, soul, and senses. Her limbs were stiff as stone, her eyes half closed as if trying to escape reality. She didn't know where she was. She didn't even know if she was still herself. Amid the darkness, there was a muffled sound. The young princess, with beautiful green eyes and blonde hair, wondered what that sound was filling her ears. A childish voice, a plea. Before the girl's senses completely gave out, she realized there was someone in front of her. A masked boy with ashen hair was shedding tears above her. The boy was calling out to her with a desperate expression, but she could only think about how beautiful the prince's eyes were. The sadness of the little monster seemed to grow with each passing second. And the last thought of the blonde before blacking out was a question about why that poor child was crying. The young lady felt a brief warmth, and then everything darkened. She wanted to open her eyes, but her body wouldn't obey. Still, she could feel his presence. Real, intense, and suffering. Sometime later, the little majesty woke up in her comfortable bed. The ceiling and walls that greeted her were high and adorned with golden frescoes. The maids around her soon screamed in surprise and relief. Wearing a blue nightgown, the protagonist rested her head on her hand to fully regain her senses. Her thin arms seemed weak, as if they had forgotten how to support a body. But the moment she realized how she was being addressed, she became confused again. The young girl quickly looked around, trying to find out if anyone else was there. Upon finding a large mirror, the blonde was startled. Her appearance was very different from what it used to be. Emerald-colored eyes, skin so white and rosy, a childish face as adorable as a porcelain doll. The little one wondered who she was and where she was. But as those people seemed trustworthy, she decided to follow their instructions. Even the bitter medicines were accepted by the sweet girl, although they affected her mood negatively after a few days. As a result of conversations with the staff, the protagonist finally found the answers to her questions. She realized she was inside the story, The Maiden and the Beast. It's a romance and fantasy novel about a maiden and a beast, the monstrous Prince Blake. It focuses on Richard, a wild man who fights fiercely to be loved by the original protagonist, Diana. And the young girl who came from another world is in the body of Anna, Diana's half-sister. Anna marries the crown prince very young and becomes the crowned princess. But she is shocked to see the cursed face of her husband, Blake. On the wedding day, she gives up on life and throws herself into a deep lake. Such a terrible incident leaves the prince devastated and makes him see himself as a monster. From that moment on, the young man's heart becomes practically impenetrable. Eventually, due to the darkness and not being chosen by Diana, his life becomes miserable. According to the original story, when Anna falls into the lake, Blake is unable to save her. But the new protagonist is in the body of the victim and is still alive. The boy from before must then be Blake. And the newcomer to this fantasy world was worried about the hatred he might already have against her. Even after 5 days of rest, Anna was still unable to feel her own legs. In her bed, her thoughts always returned to the little crybaby. She sympathized with the deep pain of the companion who had to witness the bride's despair upon discovering his real appearance. Thus, making a great effort, Anna got out of bed to visit the heir of the kingdom. The attendant present showed surprise, as she did not expect a child to recover so easily from a trauma, and warned that, although the girl was willing to visit him, he was still very shocked by the accident she had suffered. She finally recommended that if Anna was really going, it would be better to be extremely careful. A smile of understanding formed on the princess's face, and the young lady asked her companion not to worry and just take her there. Charmed by her lady's nobility, the maid accepted the order without discussion. After being dressed in a charming pink dress, they both made their way to Blake's room. The lady reflected deeply as she walked through the corridors. Abandoning the prince was not an option, and that was already decided. In fact, Anna liked the monster more than the main character. When Diana chose Richard and her ship was ruined, the girl was outraged. Anyway, now the blonde had the opportunity to change the companion's painful childhood, and this chance couldn't be abandoned, for the protagonist had nowhere else to go. The princess was born from Count Balassian and his first wife, but her mother died shortly after giving birth, and the count quickly found a second wife with whom he soon had Diana. Anna grew up being treated like a complete stranger, and being told that the prince was cursed and would not live long, the father sent his first daughter to marry him. The young outcast didn't give up on life because of Blake's unusual appearance, but because she had a huge fear of abandonment. Arriving at the royal bedroom door, the young lady decided she wouldn't allow the future king's despair. She opened the doors silently and entered slowly. Once inside the room, she revealed her presence to the noble. The boy, hiding under the sheets, was startled by the unexpected visit. He asked with a very sad voice not to come closer. However, the lady was insistent and called for his highness. Blake kept shouting for Anna not to get near, saying he was too ugly to be seen. The child trembled, thinking his fiancé would be frightened once again. The miserable behavior of someone so important was shocking. But the girl could only feel relieved, since the future king didn't hate her. He was just afraid she'd be horrified. For a few moments, the two remained silent, and after a deep sigh, the little blonde went to the young monster and pulled off the blanket covering him. There, masked, was an adorable little boy with pale hair. His surprised eyes were as red as rubies, and standing before him with an elevated posture was his beautiful fiancée. Blake stood frozen, not knowing what to say or how to react. Despite the dark marks covering the entire left side of his body, the boy was truly handsome. He and the protagonist made an enchanting couple. As soon as the little prince regained his senses, he grabbed the pillow and stammered, asking what she was doing. Blake then began pressing the pillow against his face even harder, shouting that his fiancée had pulled off his blanket without permission. Anna was shocked. For one of the main characters of an adult novel shouldn't say things like that. The pure white bunny in front of her hardly resembled the somber, dedicated noble from the original story. Even so, the confusion had to be resolved. So she approached her sad partner and caressed his soft cheek. Then she pulled off the mask that hid the marks of the curse, revealing the full face of her husband. It happened so fast he could barely speak. He only had time to beg her not to look at him, but she reached out and firmly said that the crowned prince was beautiful. That made the pale little face finally show some color. Anna revealed she had never seen anyone as handsome as His Highness before. And then, with a tender look, she smiled slightly, while Blake tried to comprehend his own emotions, which now came all at once. Those weren't empty words. They were the truth. Although part of his face was covered in black by a curse, his eyes were still large and bright. Despite his age, his features were already well-defined. His nose, mouth, and even his sharp jawline. Anyone who looked carefully would know that his face was truly beautiful. Moreover, upon meeting Diana, the curse would disappear. That face could be described as the most beautiful across all continents. A little boy as perfect now as he would be in the future. But after hearing the young lady's words, he said it couldn't be true, for everyone hated him. However, Anna did not share that feeling. The boy, because of everything he had suffered, still doubted the declarations he heard. Then he was informed by the princess herself that she hadn't given up on life the last day they saw each other. She had tripped on something and by accident ended up in the lake. This, of course, was a lie to cover up the terrible truth. And an accident would be a more acceptable excuse. The future king showed for the first time a more relieved expression. Then Anna revealed that the reason for her visit was to thank him for the enormous favor of saving her from drowning. Blake looked at her, still doubtful, with those bright eyes, and asked if that was really the reason for her coming. The protagonist said yes, for of course she would be grateful for being saved by him. At that moment, the ruby-red eyes filled with tears from the prince's emotion. He then began to cry, and his state was so miserable that he was sobbing. Blake thought she had nearly lost her life because of him, but Anna reinforced her opinion once again, saying she was very blessed to have married someone so incredible. The boy had isolated himself in the room because he thought the blonde would blame him for the disaster, so it was a relief to find out that wasn't the case. The protagonist assumed a sad expression as the little prince had to endure that weight during the 5 long days she was unconscious. Thus, she quickly placed her hand on the boy's shoulder to give him comfort. Then she hugged him, saying she liked him and asking him not to worry. People usually believe that childish love is always pure, and this moment greatly contributed to that belief. The young boy then hugged her back and said his feelings were the same. Anna, however, didn't believe Blake, who in the novel favored Diana. The emperor, knowing he liked her, arranged a marriage with Count Balatian. And of course, the count's first reaction was to protect his youngest daughter and send the eldest. Now, even with the lies, at least that's what the new protagonist thought, she felt more at ease. And suddenly, she asked her husband if they could rest together. Blake was startled and began to blush until he was red as a pepper. Little by little, he backed away and hugged his knees. He was once again paralyzed, and his mouth trembled from nervousness. That's when the girl realized that the suggestion could be interpreted improperly and also felt uncomfortable. However, the proposal was made to help the boy. The Balatian family had the power of light. It was thanks to this that Diana managed to remove Blake's curse in the original story. Anna also possessed this ability, but only a small amount of light, incomparable to Diana's gift. Besides, Blake's curse didn't just affect his appearance. He also felt constant pain, and the colder it got, the worse it became. The groom had jumped into the icy water to save her, so he must have felt immense pain. But he wasn't the type to admit his feelings. Physical contact is necessary to use the power of light, as expected from a novel rated 19+. Instead, sleeping side by side holding hands would be the best option. But Blake's expression made her feel as if she had made a huge mistake. Anna then asked His Highness not to misunderstand her. Since they were married, it was natural to sleep together. There was nothing to be embarrassed about. However, Blake trembled and buried his face in the pillow. He was still embarrassed. The protagonist wondered where the fierce Blake from the original story had gone. Instead of a frightening man, an adorable child was sitting in front of her. Human growth is truly mysterious, for this little bunny would turn into a brutal man in 10 years. Puberty can work wonders. Anyway, she couldn't leave him like that, so she grabbed the pillow he was holding and squeezed his hands tightly. Like a newlywed couple, she suggested they rest together from that moment on. The marked child shyly asked if they would do this every day, and the maiden responded with another question, asking if this closeness made him uncomfortable. Since the arrangement didn't displease anyone, everything was settled. To lessen her partner's insecurities, the princess said she was fine with it because she liked the heir of the empire very much. Blake widened his already large eyes and couldn't say anything as his entire face turned red. She squeezed both his hands once again, and then she asked if he was feeling better. The pain from the curse would go away when he held Diana's hands, the heroine, in the original novel. But Anna's power didn't seem to work very well. Now that she had transmigrated into this novel, she wanted to help the boy, who would live in pain until he met Diana, but she didn't have the power to do so. She then released his hands and threw them over the quilt, but suddenly the sleeve of her dress was tugged. Blake approached and hugged her from behind. With his head close to hers, he whispered that Anna's hands were warm, and as he squeezed them again, he asked his beloved not to let him go. She couldn't see his face because he hugged her from behind, but she could hear the tremble in his voice. The blonde comforted him, saying she wasn't going anywhere. And when he pouted like a baby, Anna stated she had just gone down to get a blanket. Then Blake's face turned red, and he quickly returned to the bed. The boy seemed deeply nervous. The princess asked if his willingness to sleep beside her had vanished, but the prince said that wasn't the case. He was just worried about how she would feel spending the night next to a monster. The girl's reaction was intense, and she insisted her companion stop calling himself that way. Anna took his hand and looked directly into his red eyes, saying the young man didn't look like a monster at all, and she was sure the curse would soon be lifted. Blake looked at her a little confused, but she continued, saying they would resolve it sooner or later. On his 18th birthday, when he reached adulthood, his curse would eventually be lifted. The days wouldn't be so terrible in the future, so discouragement was not allowed, and there was no need to care about what other people said. A tired voice then came from his small lips. Just as there was a heir of light, there was a heir of the curse in the imperial family. Emperor Philip, the founder of the empire, was in a romantic relationship with the goddess of light. The goddess of light shared her power with her beloved, and he founded the empire with that power. But after Philip became emperor, he betrayed the goddess of light and fell in love with another woman. As a consequence, the furious goddess cursed Philip's descendants. The heir of the curse would have black markings inscribed on his face, and when they covered the whole body, he would end up dying. It's said that all heirs of the curse died before reaching adulthood. It could be that on the night of his 18th birthday, Blake would be on the verge of death. But if Anna managed to reunite him with Diana, everything would be fine. Thus, she gently held the boy's hand and entwined her pinky finger with his. She then promised he would be cured, even if it cost her life. He pulled his hands back and shouted he would never allow such a sacrifice. She should continue living, even if the heir to the throne was gone. Pulling the crybaby's hand back, she dedicated herself to calming him. Neither of them would die, so there was no need to worry. Blake quickly showed he was a true crybaby, as his heavy tears began wetting his face. Anna wiped his tears with a handkerchief, but she took the opportunity to tease her husband. Blake pouted while holding back his tears and snot. However, he was soon overwhelmed by his emotions and curled up beside his wife. The blonde wrapped her arms around him, feeling him calm instantly at her touch. The tears stopped, leaving only wet streaks running down his face. Then his eyelids slowly grew heavy and gave in. Anna hugged him until they fell asleep in the same bed. When the sun rose and the rays of sunlight came through the window panes, Anna woke up. She slowly opened her eyes while murmuring something indecipherable. Then, with her green eyes open, she saw who was in front of her. A calm little child with snow-white hair and beautiful, clear but marked skin. She wondered if he had held her hand all night and found it very cute. Then she caressed his beautiful, silky hair while admiring the lovely view. Such a display of affection made the little boy open his ruby red eyes. Contrary to what was expected, he opened a mischievous smile. Then she asked the reason for such a smile, and he replied it was because he felt good. He liked Anna very much and loved the fact that she had spent the whole night with him. That made her close her lips and blush a little. The princess decided to herself that she would keep working and dedicating herself so he would continue to smile. Thus, she stayed with Blake for a few days. After spending all that time with him, she noticed he rarely left his room unless necessary. He ate and read in his own room. Moreover, Anna also noticed something else strange while eating with her husband every day. Again and again, vegetables, vegetables, and more vegetables. For the third day in a row, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It was a banquet for rabbits, not for humans. The menu was also always the same. Practically nothing changed. and even the soup was the same as the day before. Not to mention there was no care in seasoning the food. So the wife asked His Highness what kind of food he liked. The little prince replied that anything was fine, but she insisted, asking if he liked meat or fish, and the little boy very cheerfully said yes, so he wasn't a vegetarian. Besides, there was no particular food to be careful about since the boy had no allergies. It was obvious the servants didn't want to put in too much effort for that poor boy. The employees ignored his needs because he was a cursed prince. Such blatant treatment must have been the work of the eldest son of Marquis Hamel. Blake noticed the unusual expression on the young lady's face and asked if there was a problem, but she convinced him everything was fine. Then, Anna called for the maid Melissa and asked her to tell the head servant to visit her after the meal. There was something she wanted to confirm. After the woman left, she quickly relaxed her stiff expression and smiled brightly. She didn't want to worry Blake about anything. She then offered him some mushrooms, even though he didn't like eating them. While holding the mushrooms in front of him, Blake reluctantly opened his lips. When the spoon entered his mouth, he wore an uncomfortable expression. Since Anna asked him to chew instead of swallowing with water, he did as told. The moment the mushroom went down his throat, he felt triumphant, and he quickly grabbed the protagonist's hands tightly. When the air had contact with the blonde, he could feel the warmth and it calmed him. If Blake felt comfortable, it meant she really had some light power. After finishing the meal, Anna returned to her room and immediately called the head servant of the Crown Prince's palace. The man entered with a proud step. She could tell he was arrogant just from his expression. Finally, he asked about the reason for the summons, and the maiden pointed out that the quality of the meal was very inadequate. The Marquis's son assumed a disdainful expression and said it wasn't an emergency. But the princess insisted, asking if a problem with the Crown Prince's meal wasn't an urgent matter. After a mocking, bitter smile, he said that Her Highness had just arrived and didn't know many things. But the budget allocated to the Crown Prince wasn't very suitable. That terrible creature began blaming His Majesty. He lied smoothly without a shred of remorse. That place wasn't fancy enough to be called luxurious, but it wasn't so desolate that there wouldn't be meat sent from time to time. So the young protagonist closed her eyes and said she understood the situation. Thinking he had convinced her, the traitor said he was glad for the girl's understanding, but she finally said she would dismiss him. The man was terribly surprised. The arrogant expression of the traitor twisted. Instead of dealing with him any longer, she turned and gave her orders to Eden, the knight standing beside him. She told Sir Eden to arrest the Marquis's son on the charge of embezzling the Crown Prince's budget. The former servant asked if she understood what embezzlement meant. She said she knew, and that was exactly what he had done. The culprit's face instantly turned pale. His eyes and mouth opened wide in a stunned expression, and when Eden dragged him out, he screamed in anger. He shouted to be released immediately. Claiming he was the heir of the Marquis Hamel's family, he declared that the knight would regret doing this and should let go of his hand. He must have been raised believing he was superior to everyone else just because of his origins. Eden paid no attention to his words and dragged him out immediately. When the head servant was suddenly taken away, the atmosphere in the Crown Prince's palace fell into disarray. But instead of calming the atmosphere, the princess increased her efforts and dismissed another batch of people in the palace. When Blake was expelled from the position of Crown Prince, most of the courtiers betrayed him and sided with the male protagonist, Richard. There was no need to keep future traitors around. Anna dismissed all those who despised Blake, were disloyal, or had betrayed him in the original story. The blonde was warned that all the servants and maids had been chosen by the emperor himself, and maid Melissa was worried about the consequences her lady might suffer. In the original story, she had remained faithful to her masters until the very end. The maiden immediately and without worries replied that it was all right. The emperor wouldn't blame her. She was confident about that. Then the maid asked how she would like her meal. The princess said she would prepare the dish herself that day, leaving her servant confused. She then went with Melissa to the storeroom. The place had a variety of healthy ingredients, including oriental ingredients like miso and red pepper paste. Not only were there many kinds of spices, but also all sorts of stored foods. Anna was filled with anger as she remembered how poor the heir's diet had been until that moment. She then rolled up her sleeves and began cooking. After the master chef finished preparing the meal, she called Blake to the dining room. The moment he slid into the chair, she served him a soybean paste stew, rice, and dongle. She didn't make any fancy dish because she only knew the essential recipes. Besides, it was a challenge to find the right flavor like that of a Korean soybean paste stew. But none of that mattered, for it was the effort that counted. Blake asked what all that was, and Anna replied that it was a dish from the East. The girl said she had read the recipe in a book and decided to try making it herself. The prince was impressed by his wife's independence. Blake adjusted himself in the chair with a curious look, and looking at the dish, shyly asked how he should eat it. Anna laughed and remembered that all of this was completely new to him. Thus, she gave him a charming smile and fed him. His Highness chewed the food and then smiled. The food tasted delicious. Although it was milder than Korean stew, she had been worried because it had a very unique flavor compared to the standards of that world. However, it seemed to suit the little prince's taste. At that moment, Blake's eyes shone like diamonds, and he said it was the best food he had ever tasted. So she promised she would make those dishes more often. Seeing Blake eating so happily, Anna felt very much at peace. It must be how parents feel when they see their children eating happily, and the protagonist was determined to do everything she could to make him happy. She would stay by his side until he became an adult and no longer needed her company. She wanted to save Blake by herself, but there was no way to end the curse. She could only protect him until he met Diana. Since The Lady and the Beast was a novel for readers 19 and older, the story began from the moment the main characters became adults. There weren't many details about their respective childhoods. Still, the author gave a brief explanation of the characters. Blake went through 3 great tragedies as a child. The first tragedy was becoming the heir of the curse of the goddess of light. The second was losing Anna on his wedding day. And the last was the death of his father, Emperor Teotiste. After the emperor died, Duke Casil, Blake's uncle and Richard's father, became the new sovereign. He expelled Blake from the position of crown prince, and the helpless boy spent his childhood miserably exiled on some southern island. Now, Blake had already become the heir of the curse. That happened before the protagonist inhabited that body. But the end of his father, Emperor Teotiste, was a future that hadn't yet arrived. She could prevent that situation. She just needed to try. As soon as the crown prince's wedding ceremony ended, the emperor departed for the Valley of Chaos, so they just had to wait for his return. Blake loved Korean food. He wasn't just saying it was delicious because she had made it. It really suited his taste. The little boy stuffed himself, and so she enjoyed making it too. Thus, her ambitions grew even more, and she wanted to make a complete meal. She decided to build a furnace and a cauldron. There was a limit to making Korean food with the utensils available at that time. She had already completed the plan for producing the cauldrons in her mind. She would draw the image for the cauldron and adjust the designs with the blacksmith while they created the prototype. If they asked what the cauldron was and how she thought of it, she could simply say she saw it in a cookbook about the East. Anna made up her mind and wandered through the palace to find a place to set up her future creation. While she was standing, evaluating a corner, someone appeared behind her and asked what the blonde was doing. Then she looked back very surprised, which made the young dark-haired man extend his hand and apologize. He hadn't meant to scare her. He was still young, but he was tall and well-built. His face was sharp and defined, and he had dark, thick eyebrows combined with a slightly angular chin. Unlike the mysterious and handsome Blake, he was a boy with wild and intense features. However, his red eyes were full of arrogance. The protagonist instinctively realized who he was. Black hair, red eyes, and a scar on his neck. This boy was Richard, the male protagonist of The Maiden and the Beast. The boy's arrogant smile deepened, and he said it had been a long time since they last met. Anna's fear was confirmed. Richard was the second son of the emperor's brother, Duke Casil. Since Blake, the crown prince, was cursed and destined not to live long, the sons of Duke Casil were considered next in the line of succession to become the next emperor. However, Richard was far from obtaining the rights to succeed the throne. After all, his mother was a humble slave. The empire didn't discriminate much against illegitimate children, but it was a different story if they were children of slaves. Besides, the boy was not born with silver hair, a symbol of the imperial family. After Emperor Teotiste's death, his younger brother, Arnold Casil, deposed Crown Prince Blake and ascended to the throne. It was Richard who made the most contributions at that time. He was the best among the Duke's 3 sons, but wasn't recognized because of his mother's blood. Carrying the ambition to become emperor, he trampled over his enemies one by one and eventually ascended to the highest position. At the end of the novel, he used Diana to completely get rid of Blake. This time, Anna would prevent those events from happening. Emperor Teotiste wouldn't die prematurely, nor would Blake be deposed from the throne. The little boy was happy as he was. If the curse were lifted, he would become the next emperor without any problems. There would be no space for Richard to intervene. The princess then asked what she could do for the young master. But why had the male protagonist come to see her? The Duke's son was a calculating man. He wouldn't do anything that didn't benefit him. Thus, he approached Diana in the original because he felt she was very valuable, as she had lifted Blake's curse. Although he eventually realized his genuine love for the heroine, considering it was a romance novel. Someone without character like him wouldn't have found any use in the wife of an abandoned prince. According to him, Anna had made a big fuss right after getting married. He had heard that she dismissed many of the palace's servants. She then understood everything. Apparently, the boy must have planted a spy among the servants the princess had dismissed. Therefore, the young lady asked him to continue his reasoning. Richard said she had acted hastily. So unlike herself, he spoke as if he knew her well. So there must have been a point of contact between Richard and Anna. The boy kept pointing out the girl's mistakes. He said the family of Marquis Hamel had the emperor's trust. He claimed it was very bold of her to imprison the eldest son of the current patriarch. His Majesty himself had chosen all the other courtiers. It wasn't right to simply dismiss them. Of course, the dark-haired boy thought that way. After all, they were all spies planted by the Duke's family. She held back what she wanted to say and smiled as if she knew nothing. The princess said she couldn't keep people she wasn't able to trust. But according to Richard, if she wanted loyalty, she needed generosity. And she couldn't achieve that if she dismissed people so easily. Anna wondered why the hell that guy suddenly appeared before her and bothered to give her a ridiculous lecture. Thus, she revealed that he was being rude, and none of that situation was the young master's business. So, considering that he was sticking his nose where it didn't belong, the blonde told him to leave. Richard, however, wore quite an arrogant expression. He asked if she was in a bad mood, or if she was still upset because he hadn't accepted her love. The blonde was outraged and asked what nonsense that was. Richard replied that in the past, the princess had confessed to him. The boy was a schemer, but he wasn't the type to make up a story. It didn't appear in the original plot, but it seemed that Anna liked Richard. The teenager said he didn't want to reject her, but was the son of a slave and couldn't go against an order from the emperor. The protagonist held herself back, but was trembling with anger because of the visitor's audacity. Richard claimed that she was a nice person, so she should understand his heart. But when the young duke insisted on Anna's supposed feelings, her last thread of reason snapped. She said he must be delirious because no one in their right mind would feel that way. Richard's arrogant smile stiffened. He was then called rude and questioned how he dared say such a thing to the crown princess. The blonde asked if he intended to insult the imperial family. Embarrassed, the visitor tried to take the girl's hand, but someone else stopped him. It was Blake. The prince grabbed Richard's hand firmly and looked at him with disdain. He firmly declared that his beloved hated that kind of treatment. Richard's eyes widened, scared by the crown prince's sudden appearance. And when he tried to explain it as a misunderstanding, he was interrupted again. Blake made it clear that she was no longer a mere lady. She was his wife. Thus, Richard lowered his head, embarrassed. He asked for forgiveness and admitted he had misspoken. However, he was warned to be careful in the future. If he disrespected the crown princess again, he would not be forgiven. He was then ordered to disappear from the king's son's sight. The scene left the blonde impressed. Richard fled, his face pale and his tongue clicking. While watching the dark-haired boy's back, Blake carefully pulled her hand. The little one asked her not to look. He didn't want his wife looking at other men besides him. His expression was pleading, so she blinked twice and held the little prince's hands. She said she wasn't looking and squeezed them tighter. Besides, in the girl's opinion, he wasn't a man. He was a dog. Blake didn't understand. Then Anna explained that he was a real fool, going around assuming other people's feelings. Richard could only be a true madman. Still insecure, Blake asked if his wife wasn't interested in his cousin since he was very popular. Anna replied that she completely hated that disgusting style of his. She liked cute boys who looked like rabbits. Since she had once described the crown prince that way, he pulled his wife's hand to his face and began to smile. He rubbed his cheeks against her palms, feeling much more cheerful. It was such an adorable scene that the protagonist's eyes sparkled with joy. That simple moment had just healed all the anger she had accumulated. Then she asked what kind of girl His Highness liked, to which he immediately replied that it was Anna, and it didn't matter what specifications she wanted. He always answered that the type of girl he liked was someone with Anna's characteristics. Blake only needed her, and she affectionately said she felt the same way. All the girl needed was her husband. Later, while it was still light, Anna was preparing her husband's bath inside the castle. She put her hand in the water to check the temperature, and it was perfect. Then the young lady pulled back the curtains of Blake's room and called him, saying that from that day on, she would help him bathe. The little boy froze and didn't know what to say. When the girl's words finally sank in, the prince slowly began to back away, and he said he would come later. However, at that same moment, he was captured by Anna, who firmly held him by the shoulders. But Blake quickly shouted no, because he would be extremely tormented if she ended up infected by the curse. But the blonde calmly said she wouldn't be infected. The little one then argued that prolonged exposure could bring bad luck to the lovely girl. There was a terrible rumor that if you saw or touched the marks of the curse of the goddess of light, you would either be infected by it or the curse would bring you bad luck. Because of those false rumors, the heir of the curse couldn't even go outside and was supposed to be confined to an island in the south. As soon as the curse appeared on Blake, he was supposedly supposed to lose his position as crown prince and be sent far away. However, thanks to Emperor Teotiste, who strongly opposed it, he was able to continue living in the palace. Anna stated that bad luck wouldn't come her way and asked her beloved to ignore all those false rumors. But he kept shouting that they didn't know if the rumors were true or false. The blonde continued saying that she had already seen his face and even held his hands and nothing had happened. The masked boy still insisted that those were just small parts of his body. Seeing and touching all his skin would be very dangerous. In response, the princess gently took the boy's hand, but the child quickly pulled it away, saying he was deplorable, that he was a monster. Blake believed that if Anna saw him completely, she would start to hate him. But after all, the rumors were just an excuse. The truth was that he didn't want to show the curse on his body. Since the maiden had already seen the marks on his face and hands, she thought seeing his body would be permitted, but apparently she had made a mistake. The lady approached His Highness and asked him to look into her eyes. Hesitantly, the boy lifted his head. When they were finally face to face, the girl reminded him that she had previously told him never to call himself a monster again. Blake was not monstrous, much less an abomination. Touching him did not make her unhappy. Quite the opposite. Since the day they got married, she had been as happy as possible. When asked if she was really telling the truth, Anna replied that she was. She was very grateful that His Highness was her husband. Thus, the two hugged, and the prince's heart could rest. The poor little boy was also very happy to have received such a wife. He agreed never to say bad things about himself again. When the suggestion of the bath was brought up again, Blake was surprised and blushed once more. Then he demonstrated his refusal by shaking his head. It seemed he still clung to some insecurities. The girl asked why it wouldn't be fine, since everything was fine for her. The little boy said he was shy and turned even redder. She burst out laughing, asking if he was embarrassed, and the boy began to plead with her not to joke about such things. While Anna declared how cute he was and insisted she hadn't been joking, Blake hid his hands, saying she was teasing him. The blonde then became curious and asked how the little boy handled the attendants who gave him baths. But he replied that it was fine because they weren't Anna, meaning they weren't the person he liked. She questioned if she was being discriminated against, and he assured her that wasn't the case. Therefore, as there were no problems, she pulled him by the arm, saying they should go already. Defeated, the noble nodded in agreement. Thus, the two stood up and headed toward the bath. When the little prince was undressing, he begged her not to be shocked by what she would see. With a serious look, Anna reminded him that he had promised not to say anything negative about himself. If the boy kept belittling himself, she would become deeply angry. But it seemed Blake wasn't even capable of listening to her. The little boy's eyes were full of despair, and he begged her never to leave him. But before he became an adult, Anna would have to leave. Only the blessed Diana could free him from the terrible curse. Her duty toward that young boy was to keep him safe and protected. Thus, she remained in deep and complete silence for a while. Blake noticed and began to cry, believing she would leave him very soon. So she lied, saying that such a situation would not occur. She stated that there was no reason to leave her husband, who looked like the cutest white bunny. She extended her hand once more and gently wiped the child's tears. Finally, she turned to the bathtub and said that if they continued at that pace, there would never be a bath. With tightly closed lips, Blake slowly began removing his clothes. The black pattern already covered the entire left side of the boy from head to toe. Even though she was impressed, Anna used all her strength to keep a firm and expressionless face. In the Duke's mansion, Richard sat in his office, evaluating all the changes in the situation and, consequently, in his plans. Young Anna had dismissed most of the older servants and courtiers. Duke Casil and his half-brother Frank were furious. They said that a mere 10-year-old girl had managed to cause a gigantic problem in the supervision of the crown prince. The maid who was supposed to bathe Blake was quite disappointed, as she had tried excessively hard to secure the position. The only trump card Richard still believed he possessed was the crown princess herself. In the past, every time they met, she secretly threw affectionate glances at him. The girl wasn't capable of hiding her true feelings. It had been too easy to seduce such a lonely and desperate child. If he could turn the girl into his puppet, it would be much more effective and convenient than having those spies. But the Duke's son's prediction was completely wrong. Even the young monster had changed. He was more confident and determined. And it wasn't just about his strength. There was something much more fundamental that was different. Anna's existence must have affected his view of himself. That was the opinion of the young, opportunistic, and ambitious boy. While sipping his tea, a desire began to grow inside Richard. He wanted to possess the girl, no matter what it took. At the same time the little Duke was orchestrating his next terrible moves, Anna was bathing her beloved husband. She couldn't show even a hint of her shock. All that black pattern on his small body was a horrible sight. When he was completely exposed, he watched her very nervously. He extended his small marked hand, and the princess took it. To lighten the heavy atmosphere, the girl asked what they should do when the prince was so skinny. She then asked him to get into the bathtub so he wouldn't get sick from the cold. The protagonist was very careful while scrubbing his back, especially on the affected areas. Those were certainly the most sensitive parts and would cause more pain with friction. Blake was only 8 years old, and the situation was already so dangerous. The blonde had once heard that when the marks spread, they were accompanied by pain. That little boy had probably already suffered much more in life than she imagined. The protagonist carefully ran her hands over the affected area, which made the boy worried. But Anna soon started singing to distract and relax him. The part of the song about the belly made him very embarrassed, splashing water everywhere. He made it clear that his belly wasn't full of poop, just that he had eaten a lot. But Anna explained, laughing, that it was basically the same thing. Then Blake declared that from that moment on, he wouldn't eat anymore. However, his determination quickly disappeared when his wife said that if he didn't, he would stay smaller than her. Thus, the little bunny became depressed. After a light smile, the beautiful blonde girl told him to eat a lot and become strong, tall, and handsome. Even more handsome than he already was. The couple was already so familiar with each other that their eyes sparkled as they talked. Blake couldn't wait to become taller than his beloved. Days later, a beautiful yellow gift with 2 red roses and a letter of apology arrived. They were from Richard. The words in the letter were empty, and the girl felt very uncomfortable. She suspected he had started considering her useful, and he was thinking about seducing her to turn her into a spy for the crown prince. She thought she had rejected him firmly, but apparently he had lost his senses. So she called for Melissa and asked her to return everything. Before leaving, the maid turned to her lady and asked if it wouldn't be better to keep the letter of apology. Anna said to take the letter too, so he might understand her intentions. The blonde wondered, a little anxiously, if that would be enough to make the scoundrel give up. But shortly after, another gift arrived, and then another. They came with more flowers, more letters, and much prettier ornaments. The princess returned all of them, but it only made the gifts come more frequently and become bigger. Until one day, the butler Hans came to her a little distressed. When the protagonist said to do as always, he said that this time it was a very precious treasure. It was a ring made from the breath of the mermaid. Anna was so out of sorts that even her eyes were trembling. The breath of the mermaid was a mana stone with the power of the ocean. There was no other treasure like it in the whole world. In the original story, this was the ring Richard gave to Diana. If he had gotten to the point of giving her what should have been given to Diana, his level of madness had finally crossed human limits. She was interested in the jewel, but said she didn't need it and would never accept it, even if it was a mana stone. She then asked that Richard be told never to send her gifts again. It was a beautiful day, and wonderful white doves crossed the sky when Anna decided to go out with Melissa and Eden to visit the blacksmith. She wore a charming hat and a beautiful wine-colored dress. The girl walked so fast that even her companions had a hard time keeping up with her. It was no surprise, as it was her first time leaving the house in that new world. They arrived at a very beautiful smithy, and the little princess's eyes sparkled with anticipation. She could finally have a cauldron. Anna had brought very detailed drawings and asked, when she laid them in front of the shop owner, if he could make it without difficulty. The bald man pondered for a few moments and then gave a thumbs up, saying he would try and succeed. He proudly stated that there was nothing he couldn't produce. The girl smiled and asked him to craft it with great care. On the way back, Melissa asked if her lady would like to stop anywhere else. But Her Highness replied no, that she would be going back immediately and straight to the palace. She feared that Blake might be waiting for her, but she was too embarrassed to tell her companions the real reason for her early return. Back at the castle, Anna was still in the corridor when Blake came running to meet her and hugged her. He was sparkling and asked if everything had gone well. The sweet princess replied yes, that she had had a great outing. The little bunny was curious if anything dangerous had happened, but she calmed him by saying that nothing bad had even crossed their minds. The little one had already started worrying because for him, his wife was late returning. She blushed and was also happy to have come back almost immediately for that adorable boy. As soon as the two were alone, she removed the mask hiding the marks of the curse. When she asked if he thought it was much better without it, the prince emotionally said yes. Blake was very happy that Anna always tried to remove his mask. Since that little boy was the second male lead of a novel for readers over 19, what he was saying could be misunderstood. The lady declared that the reason she acted that way was because she felt very happy seeing her husband's beautiful face. And the little boy also felt very happy seeing her, although, of course, that was already common knowledge. Therefore, he agreed to the suggestion of not wearing his mask when they were alone. He had missed her so much that hearts seemed to float around the two of them. When the protagonist asked if anything had happened during her absence, he first answered no. But with a bit of insistence on her part, the little one revealed that he had been a bit anxious, fearing she might leave him. However, remembering all the words he had heard, he became calmer and more certain she wouldn't abandon him so easily. As those little hands trembled so much, she lied once again about staying by his side. The little boy's face lit up, but it didn't take long for it to dim again. That's because she said she would immediately step aside if His Highness fell in love with someone else. Their marriage had political purposes. It wasn't the prince's decision. In the future, once he was grown up, he could very well find true love. Blake then looked at the blonde with great determination and said he only wanted her. However, the maiden continued saying that once he became an adult and the curse was lifted, he would become very handsome and attract the attention of many women. And even after hearing that she was considered the most beautiful of all, according to the prince, she insisted that he would probably change his mind over time. Thus, the words had no effect on the princess's well-guarded heart. For that beautiful little monster, only Anna would be his wife. And he also wanted to be the only husband she would ever have. No other girl was needed to make the masked boy happy. Finally, Blake asked if, unlike him, she needed another man. Distressed by such a serious and sudden question, she pulled the little boy's hands to herself and said she didn't need any man other than him. Lying was becoming very common in the protagonist's life. Until suddenly, Blake jumped into her arms and asked her to stay with him until the moment of his death. And then he apologized for being so selfish. This time, it was she who started crying, and her tears were quickly wiped away by her husband's sleeve. Suddenly, Hans entered the room and surprised them, revealing that the emperor had returned. Finally, Blake's father, the most powerful and influential emperor in the entire history of that country, was back. He was as handsome as a man could be, and had the same features as his son. Blake asked if he was safe, and Hans replied that he was. The emperor had no wounds or scars, and had finally sealed the black portal. The prince said that sounded very good. His father was a strong man after all. After saying that, he put his mask back on, and the three of them stood still for a while in an awkward silence. The boy would not see the emperor of his own will. Then Hans went to Anna and said that someone from the smithy had come to see her. Anna seemed surprised but nodded and told her husband that she would be back soon. The heir also nodded and advised her to take good care of herself. While Hans and the blonde walked through the corridors, the butler confessed that no one from the smithy had actually come to visit her. In fact, it was His Majesty who was looking for the child. Since the young girl already expected this, there were no issues in accompanying him willingly. It was very good that he had made up that excuse. It showed great consideration on the servant's part. The servant warned that the emperor might be angry about the loss of so many courtiers. However, the protagonist didn't believe he was angry, but to others, it could seem that way. Hans advised that if His Majesty asked her about what happened, the blonde should admit she had done something wrong, and the butler would take the blame for not guiding the princess properly. That way, the emperor wouldn't scold her for long. It was the same as taking all the blame, and since he was just a commoner without a title, he could receive the death penalty. Just like in the original novel, he was still willing to give up his life for Blake, but Anna asked him not to throw his life away so easily. Without him around, who would assist the crown prince? The servant looked troubled, but the lady told him not to worry. She was confident that everything would turn out fine, so he accepted her advice and took on a happier, brighter expression. As already revealed, the curse is inherited by the descendants of the first emperor of that kingdom because he betrayed the goddess of light. The royal family had always hidden this fact, but since the goddess of light loved that empire, the curse was placed on poor souls to expose the seeds of tyranny hidden there. To protect the honor of the imperial family, they publicly announced a false fact, and the entire empire pointed their fingers at the one who inherited the marks. With the addition of the rumor about contagion, if you became the heir of the curse, you would be sent to an island in the far south and kept isolated there until death. When Blake showed the first signs, he was immediately removed from his position as crown prince and should have been confined in the south. But fortunately, Emperor Teotiste only sent him to an annexed palace. The little one would die anyway, so there was no need to go through all that problematic and troublesome procedure. There might not have been any affection, but he left the son alone as a last courtesy to his only child. However, Teotiste only pretended to be indifferent in order to protect his son. He loved Blake, and the little prince longed for his father's love. First, the protagonist would need to gain the emperor's favor, so she could act as a bridge between the two. Upon reaching the doors of the hall, she took a deep breath, pressed her lips together, and encouraged herself. Then, her name was announced, and she entered the room. Everything was so quiet that she could hear the echo of her own footsteps. Then she finally saw the glorious light of the empire, her father-in-law. She froze, for she had never seen such a handsome man. Even the roses would wish to be part of his court just to see that beautiful face frequently. It was then that the reincarnated girl concluded that this Greek god before her should have been the protagonist of the novel. Nothing better than an emperor like that to lead a novel for readers over 19. He didn't take long to mention the imprisonment of the head servant and asked why she had made such a decision. Anna replied that he had been imprisoned for embezzling funds related to the imperial prince. The Marquis of Hamel, who was also present, was furious and declared that his son had sworn loyalty to the empire and that he didn't believe such an accusation. He insisted, saying it was unfair, but the princess promptly interrupted him and presented the evidence. Teotiste read it and saw that the man had stolen a huge amount of money. That's when the Marquis trembled to his core. He shouted that everything could have been manipulated by the girl. His eldest son was more loyal than any other child in the entire empire. But the blonde quickly proved otherwise because His Highness, the Crown Prince, was eating cold spinach soup, While Hamel's son dined daily on meat cooked by the palace chef, the expression he made is really hard to describe, but it could easily be compared to that of a cornered rat. Anna continued revealing everything he had done wrong, even the times he withdrew the prince's money to spend on gambling. This made the nobleman agitated, but he soon regretted such an act. For Teotiste stated that this was not the way to speak to his daughter-in-law unless he was wishing for death. The man even tried to justify himself, saying that the crown princess had insulted his family first, but a sword appeared at that very moment beside his neck. His Majesty then asked what reason he had for moving his filthy hands. He hoped it wasn't to slap the child, because that would mean immediate execution. When the Marquis said he hadn't intended to do anything of the sort, the Emperor asked if he was lying and brought the sword even closer to the man's neck. Anna also closed her eyes and started trembling at that moment. Then, a servant of His Majesty approached her and recommended that she leave the room, as everything was resolved with her for the day. The princess was surprised but said she would be very happy to leave at that moment. On the way back, she realized that it was Colin and that she could fully trust him. So she rummaged through her pockets and took out a beautiful transparent blue orb. Inside that crystal ball was a video of Lord Hamel insulting both her and the crown prince. The girl had prepared all that because she knew she wouldn't be able to stand against a noble of such high rank as the Marquis without at least that much evidence. Colin looked at her curiously and then bowed, saying it would be handed over to His Majesty. The Marquis Hamel's hand was cut off for attempting to slap the crown princess in front of the Emperor himself, and his son's tongue was removed for embezzling imperial property and insulting His Highness. Both were sentenced to 30 years of imprisonment, and the Hamel family lost their cherished title. In just one morning, the historic Marquis family fell completely. However, no one stood by them. Raising a hand against the princess in front of the Emperor and insulting her were very serious crimes. It didn't matter how the wife of the monster had acted. The two had crossed the line. There wasn't a single person who could defend them. Later, while it was still day, Anna sat at her desk wondering how the Emperor would handle all the political problems that would come from the Marquise's absence. She kept thinking if she would be summoned again or if he would continue ignoring Blake that way. The young girl kept pondering while listening to the ticking of the clock. Finally, she stood up and clapped her hands on the table. The protagonist couldn't leave things as they were. She would go to the Emperor herself. Anna turned to Melissa and asked her to quickly prepare a carriage, as she was heading to Fillium Castle. The servant advised the girl to request an audience first instead of going to him directly without warning. But since the blonde knew he would refuse if she made a formal request, this was the only way. As she was climbing into the coach, Blake's hand pulled her dress. The masked boy asked where she was going and quickly figured out the truth. Even with Anna's lie that she was going to the plaza for a moment, the young boy asked to go along because it was his duty to protect his wife. So if she was going to meet His Majesty, he should accompany her. The protagonist didn't resist and decided to accept his company on the way to the other castle. Teotiste had a deep affection for his son. Although he couldn't summon the heir of the curse, if they went to His Majesty first, he wouldn't be able to send them away. When they reached Teotiste's chamber, they were stopped by a large bald guard. But the blonde looked him straight in the eyes and asked how he dared to touch the body of the crown princess. The man froze and lost all the color from his face, and the little lady entered the room easily and confidently, holding her husband's hand. Upon opening the door, the couple saw the beautiful sovereign wrapped only in a towel. His body looked like a work of art, sculpted for the enjoyment of very few. Drops of water still ran down his face and dripped from the tips of his hair. Anna couldn't help but blush. The handsome man looked at them, intrigued, and then asked what the problem was. But the blonde wasn't able to respond immediately. That was because His Majesty's abdomen was so perfect it gleamed, and for a moment she forgot everything, even that she was standing next to her bunny husband. The man's abs were so hard and defined they looked like pieces of a giant white chocolate bar. Since she wished to gain his favor, she should have greeted him properly and given him a cordial compliment. But things didn't go as planned, and she ended up revealing one of her deepest and most embarrassing impressions, that his abs were amazing. For a few moments, everything was so tense it felt like another world had started flashing. The little girl blushed so much it seemed she would faint at any moment, and her husband remained as innocent as ever. She stammered, trying to apologize, but he just watched her in silence. If the situation wasn't resolved, Anna would be deeply frowned upon and wouldn't be able to gain his favor. When the blonde tried to blame her lack of manners on it being the first time she had seen a man's exposed body, the situation got even worse. That was because Blake was right beside her. Teotiste then cleared his throat lightly and put on his robe. His Majesty declared that it was not a good day for a conversation and firmly tied his robe, which made her feel even worse. Father and son exchanged glances, and the man said he would summon the young lady soon. Anna felt bad, but not as bad as Blake. He had been completely ignored by his own father. The boy's anguish was very clear when the two returned to the annex. She asked if he was tired, and the little prince replied that he was, and that he wished to rest for a moment. With a sigh, he let go of Anna's hand and asked Eden to come with him for a moment. As he entered the room, the princess watched him with a worried look, but the knight said she didn't need to be anxious, as he would accompany the young master. Inside, Eden asked what His Highness's orders were, making the boy quickly turn his head to the side. He then asked the guard to take off his shirt immediately. The man was surprised but obeyed the prince's order. Leaving part of his uniform aside, Eden impressed the young boy. He had a sculpted body. Blake thought it was really cool and asked what he had to do to get all those muscles. The heir wanted to have abs because apparently his wife still didn't see him as a man. Hearing those words come out of the princess's mouth was worse for the boy than being stabbed in the back. Blake lamented, saying he had a belly full of poop, but he was comforted by Eden, who said his belly wasn't like that. The masked boy was very happy to hear Eden's words, but his mood worsened again when the guard revealed that the boy's abdomen was similar to that of a baby. Meanwhile, in his official office, the emperor was evaluating everything they had discovered about Anna. During the next bath, the crown princess gave her husband. The little one showed considerable irritation. She asked him to look at her, but in the end, the little boy only wanted to cover his own belly. Not even when he was in the water would Blake allow his wife to see or touch that part of his body. So, to cheer him up, Anna revealed that the steel pot she had ordered to be made would arrive the next day, and then she would be able to make all sorts of delicious foods for him. But his response was that he didn't want it because he didn't intend to eat for now. Since he didn't have a man's body, he would start training on his own to get ripped. That surprised her because that's when she realized that the words she had said to the emperor had left her husband deeply upset. So she asked for forgiveness, for forgetting that her companion was also a man, though that only made the situation worse. He shouted that he would have abs too, and that he would not eat anymore. Then he threw himself onto the bed before Anna had even finished drying him. The maiden approached the bed and said she liked him very much just the way he was now. And before she could compare his belly to that of a baby, she was interrupted by the prince himself saying that wasn't the case. Since Blake was already quite rebellious, she decided not to continue with what she intended to say. Instead, she threw herself on top of him and attacked him with lots of tickles. The masked boy begged her to stop, but Anna didn't listen and kept making him laugh nonstop. Finally, she hugged him, saying she wanted him to be healthy, and asked that he eat plenty the next day. Besides, if the boy wanted to grow bigger than her, he couldn't skip any of his meals. The adorable little boy then smiled, saying he understood and would eat a lot. Seeing her little bunny smiling so happily, the blonde felt greatly relieved. Meanwhile, in the emperor's conference room, a young man in a black hooded cloak appeared. His name was Yunhan, and he had bright purple eyes. Upon asking for his orders, Teotiste inquired if the crown prince and his wife had returned safely. The informant replied that they had. The two had already bathed and were now resting. When they met earlier, the sovereign saw a completely changed Blake. He used to live shrunk as if trying to erase his existence. But he stood bravely and firmly beside his wife, holding her hand. Those red eyes that used to be empty now shone deeply. Even Colin, who was cold and reserved, highly praised the princess in his report. Therefore, His Majesty asked Yunhan what his opinion of the girl was. He had observed the palace during the entire month Teotiste was away, sealing the black portal. The sovereign asked if the informant considered her trustworthy. The young man said yes, and that she was a great person. As per the emperor's orders, Yunhan had secretly watched over the crown prince during the past month. He kept an eye on the courtier's harassment, and on Blake. Thus, he could help him if his curse worsened due to the emperor's use of the power of light. However, the dark-haired youth had forgotten his purpose at some point, and ended up keeping his eyes only on Anna. She was a beautiful, intelligent, and warm person. With a lady like that by Blake's side, his life would change to the point of causing envy. Such words impressed the emperor, who didn't know his subordinate could speak like that. The servant then asked his superior if something was making him anxious. He replied no, because she was too perfect. It had been a long time since he had seen a smile like that. The next day, with the arrival of the steel cauldron, everyone was amazed. It was the first time the prince had seen anything like it. The other staff members had also never seen such a tool. Her Highness had extensive knowledge of the wonders of the East. They began to consider her a genius, which made her very embarrassed and happy. Since Anna was feeling very good, she decided to cook her best dish that day. Melissa was very anxious because how could she taste the food of someone with such a high title? But the blonde said it was fine if everyone helped. Blake then joined in and they all had a feast. However, the annexed palace received an unexpected visit. Colin and two other servants arrived by order of the emperor. They saluted His Highness, and Blake wondered what was going on. It turned out His Majesty had sent an invitation for Her Highness, the princess. This left the protagonist in a state of deep surprise. But the counselor calmly confirmed the sender and handed over the envelope. It was indeed an imperial message. The sovereign had also sent gifts for the lady. And believe it, they weren't just a few. Upon entering the palace, everything was stacked along with some flowers that had arrived. The blonde at first thought it was a mistake, and that all those gifts had been sent to the wrong person. But Cullen confirmed that wasn't the case and that all of them were for her. The young lady found no sense in it, as there was no reason to receive so many gifts. She wondered if the emperor was happy with a compliment about his abs, but that was a comical absurdity. Thus, she informed the envoys that she would visit him soon. On the day of the visit, Melissa dressed her lady in the most beautiful blue dress and styled her hair into a single beautiful braid. She looked wonderful and finished getting ready just moments before it was time to leave. Anna turned to Blake and asked if she looked well dressed. The little boy blushed furiously. It was almost possible to see the red beneath the mask. He stared at her and said she looked very beautiful. She smiled gratefully and said she would be back soon. The little prince held the maiden's hand and wished her a pleasant outing. Emperor Teotiste was waiting for his daughter-in-law, drinking tea inside the greenhouse. He looked as perfect as ever, and among all that variety of flowers, he seemed even more beautiful. Sun rays passed through the greenhouse roof and illuminated the small water channels when the young lady arrived. The whole scene looked like a dream. Reaching the table, she bowed and greeted His Majesty the Emperor. Teotiste asked her to sit down, and Anna did so. The first thing the man decided to do was compliment the girl's dress, and she seized the opportunity to thank him for all the gifts she had received, especially the golden dress, which matched her preferences perfectly. The sovereign was quick to ask if she liked gold. After sweating lightly, the girl explained that the reason she loved the dress was because she could match it with the crown prince's clothes. She was then questioned about her feelings for her husband. The lady replied that the simple fact they were married already made him very pleasant to her. But the emperor was insistent and asked how she could like someone like him. The protagonist was clever and quickly rephrased, asking if there was anyone capable of hating him. Teotiste stated that many despised his son. Anna said that they didn't count because they were people blinded by rumors, and she declared that His Majesty also loved him. The man was surprised, and placing his teacup on the saucer, said that she had been rude because that child was the heir of the curse. Anna reminded him that he was still his son, and she was sure of his paternal love for him. The maiden seemed absolutely confident that he loved his son, so the emperor asked where such boldness came from. The young woman replied that this confidence came from the fact that she had received so many gifts. Someone who hates their descendant doesn't try to please their daughter-in-law. But Teotiste argued that he only sent them as an apology for the Marquis's actions. However, the day before, he had also forgiven her for her indecent words. She was so embarrassed she could barely remember in detail what she had said. The man laughed and said she had been really bold. The girl blushed and laughed heartily in response. Then a huge amount and variety of sweets and snacks were served. The princess was delighted and thanked him for the food. As soon as she tasted one of the cakes, she declared that the flavor was wonderful, but her expression soon clouded as she remembered her beloved husband, who had been left alone in the annex palace. The blonde then told the sovereign that the crown prince would love to eat all that variety of treats. Although his expression didn't change, Teotiste revealed his emotions through his surprised eyes. He then said that the treats could also be sent to the prince's palace. This made Anna radiant, and she quickly thanked him with a huge smile on her face. The light of the empire also smiled slightly, pleased with the wife his son had. When he asked about the young woman's knowledge of Eastern culture, she felt cornered. It was obvious he had sent someone to observe her closely. Since it was very difficult to find books on such culture in the empire, the blonde decided to give a different excuse. He wouldn't believe she had acquired all the knowledge from the county library. So she stood up and slowly approached her father-in-law. Getting closer to his ear, she whispered that she was a polyglot. That is, that she was able to understand and use all the languages of that world. The monarch found it very strange and questioned if it was really true. Anna, using a cute little girl's expression, easily lied, saying yes, and she even called His Majesty father. The sovereign was surprised and asked the girl to explain why she had addressed him that way. The blonde informed him that since she was now his daughter-in-law, His Majesty had become her father. The man, enchanted by the idea of having a daughter, agreed with the girl's position without any problems. He admitted that it must have been very difficult for her to marry so suddenly, and declared that she could visit him whenever she needed anything. The protagonist said it was agreed and that she would visit him often. Back at home, the maiden wasted no time and prepared a soybean paste stew, rice, and mushroom omelets. For any Korean, those dishes were everyday fare. But for the residents of the annexed palace, it was a gift from the heavens. The princess encouraged them to eat well, and at the end, she offered another dish to cleanse the palate. Meanwhile, outside the hall, Yoonhan was watching them and struggling to control his desires. As the emperor's shadow, he had always been kept secret from the outside world. If His Majesty hadn't saved him while he was being pursued by the government, Yunhan would have long since kicked the bucket. Since he owed his life to the emperor, the young man became his shadow and took on various unofficial duties, without a single failure. But he couldn't ignore the incredible smell coming from the food being cooked in the cauldron. Yunhan had tasted all kinds of delicacies alongside the emperor, but this was the first time he was drooling with desire. Just one bite wouldn't hurt, so he carefully approached the cauldron. It was similar to what his mother used to use at home. When he grabbed the lid and pushed it aside, he realized he might not be able to stop at just one spoonful, but he noticed someone approaching. So the young man had no choice but to hide. It was Anna, and she soon noticed that someone had tampered with the pot, which was very strange because apparently there was no one around. Then she noticed a small black cat. She found it very cute, so she picked up the animal and asked if it had been the one to remove the lid. The feline just meowed, showing that it was hungry, but it didn't want just anything. It wanted that stew. It meowed several times until the protagonist decided to share a little with it. Anna filled a small dish and left it for the animal to lick. Her opinion was that it must have a terrible owner because it looked starved, but if it needed a mistress, she would gladly raise it. Turning into a cat might not have been the best choice after all. Blake arrived soon after and asked what his beloved was doing. She explained that she had found a black cat, but the boy was only worried about how she was hugging it. The blonde's affection was excessive, and Blake quickly realized it was a male. The moment the princess decided to check to see if it was true, Yunhan ran off to a high place. The princess was disappointed because she had really liked the animal. She hoped at least to see it again. Later, at the imperial palace, Anna went to meet her father-in-law, who was surprised by the speed of her return. The lady had decided to bring His Majesty a special broth she had made earlier. It had a very pleasant appearance and aroma, and according to the monarch himself, the taste did not disappoint. Teotiste stated that his daughter-in-law had excellent cooking skills. Since he was pleased with that small gift, she decided to make the stew more often, and the emperor himself asked her to visit him frequently. At dusk, the beautiful maiden stretched out on the bed to rest, but she was surprised by her husband, who, approaching where she was, began acting like a cat. It was such an unexpected behavior that the princess was startled. Blake then explained that since Anna only liked cats, he wished to become one. The little prince didn't want her looking at any other male animal because she already had him. For her, he could be a rabbit, a cat, or even a dog. So he kept meowing and purring, leaving the little princess over the moon. It was an explosion of cuteness. Meanwhile, Richard was receiving a report on the latest events at the imperial palace. The young man couldn't believe what he was reading. All that interest in the East and the fact that the emperor himself was sending daily gifts to Anna. The little duke wondered what exactly she had done to earn the sovereign's affection. Emperor Teotiste was the only one Richard admired. He had tried everything to gain his attention, but that man's heart was like a fortress that couldn't be opened or conquered. First the monstrous prince, and now even the monarch was enchanted by her. It was very hard to believe that such a profound change could happen so quickly. If the dark-haired boy had known all this would happen, he would have accepted the young girl's feelings when she confessed. The girl used to follow him everywhere, always declaring her deepest feelings. She never missed a chance to be close to him, but after the marriage, everything changed. Anna became cruel. However, because of that bold behavior, he began to desire her even more. The harder something is to get, the more you want it. Richard could do anything to make that child his. Moments later, he was summoned to his father's office, and as soon as he entered, he had to dodge a candlestick thrown at him. Duke Kessel angrily demanded why there were no results. The crown princess was becoming more and more influential, able to enter and leave the main imperial palace as if it were her own property. Moreover, Anna would even be present at the royal ball of the Sealing Festival. This was a festival held to celebrate the emperor's return after he carefully sealed the dark portal. It was the most important event in the kingdom. Ambassadors from all countries would gather at that party. If the emperor appeared holding the young crown princess's hand, everything would be over, because Blake's status as prince would be solidified. The duke shouted at his son, saying he hadn't been able to handle either the marquis or the festival. According to the nobleman, Richard's failure only proved there was slave blood running through his veins. Then the young man declared that he had an idea capable of turning things around. He intended to bring the protagonist to his side. He would do it using Count Balatian, because Anna always desired her father's love. At that, Casil's lips curled in satisfaction, because Count Balatian was an easy opponent to deal with. The crown princess's father never cared about her, and in his presence, the girl was always apologizing. The gravity of the situation didn't matter. Since the count hated the blonde's deceased mother, he wished his eldest daughter would die, and always said that the sooner she was gone, the better it would be for his family. The maiden then woke up suddenly amidst tears because those terrible memories had all come back at once in the form of a nightmare. Blake was nearby and thought he had caused it, but she quickly pulled him close, and she asked His Highness to stay like that with her, because the sweet girl loved lying beside her husband in that way. Far from there, the Count and his friend were talking about their daughters. The other man was telling rumors he had heard, including that His Majesty had rented an entire shop for Her Highness. It was such an unusual decision that his friend's daughter threw a tantrum. The man also revealed that the crown princess had received a very valuable pink diamond as a gift. Meanwhile, Count Balatian merely nodded lightly, because it was the first time he was hearing such things. After he sent his eldest daughter to the monstrous prince instead of his beloved Diana, he hadn't contacted her even once. But Anna ended up gaining the emperor's favor, and she must have been enjoying her new family very much at that exact moment. This left him completely irritated, but his thoughts were soon interrupted by the arrival of the butler, who informed him that His Grace, the Duke, wished to see him. Upon entering the room where the emperor's brother was, he was immediately greeted by Casil. It had been a while since they had last seen each other, but in reality, the reason was that the Duke had always ignored Count Balatian. However, now that Anna had been favored by His Majesty's interest, he wanted to get closer to the girl's father. As the protagonist's father approached, the Duke immediately began asking about Anna. The Count revealed that the girl listened to everything he said and could even pretend to be dead if he asked her to fake it. Casil then said that such a well-educated child was very rare to find these days. He then asked if his second daughter was as excellent as the first. The man quickly declared that there was no comparison between the two because Diana was his greatest pride. Upon hearing that she was so excellent, the Duke revealed his interest in making her his daughter-in-law. This deeply surprised the blonde's father, because if Diana married Duke Casil's son, she could become the empress in the not-so-distant future. Then he could finally be the emperor's father-in-law. But there was a condition. Before that, His Grace would have to check how well-educated his children truly were, which in other words meant turning Anna into a puppet. Thus, the patriarch of the Balatian family said he would take care of everything immediately. At the Crown Prince's castle, Anna was suffering from a migraine due to the terrible memories from the childhood of the body she now inhabited. All the mistreatment and abuse she suffered could fill a book. How could a father say such terrible words to his own daughter? Looking at her still so small hand, the blonde wondered how exhausted the real Anna must have felt to throw herself into the lake. The state of depression the real character was in must have been very deep. The one who had killed her was her own father, the head of the county. He was nothing less than a murderer, even if he wasn't directly involved. At that moment, the girl's train of thought was interrupted by the timely arrival of Melissa. Apparently, after so long, the princess's father had come to visit her. The lady put on a distressed expression, but asked the servants to send him to the reception room. That nobleman was extremely arrogant. He believed the young lady should run to greet him the moment he arrived. The fool had already decided he would teach her proper manners the moment he saw her. Almost an hour passed before the door to the room was opened. The man had just started complaining about the delay when he froze at the sight. She looked stunning and displayed the posture of royalty. Her whole body was adorned with the finest jewels, and her gaze was so confident that her own father wondered if that child was really the true Anna. The blonde got straight to the point and asked what he wanted, but the Count considered her words very insolent and was determined to remind her who was really in charge. However, Melissa asked him to maintain proper composure before Her Highness, and that only made him even angrier. It's truly amazing how maturity never seems to reach some people. They are easily deceived, but continue to believe they have better judgment about everything. The moment he tried to vent his anger on the servant, the Crown Princess warned him not to be rude to her protégé, and declared that if he continued to behave rudely, she would leave the room at once. The Count then raised his hand to slap her, but was reminded by the protagonist herself of the punishments Marquis Hamill received for trying the same thing. The beautiful lady remained completely calm, but her father, gritting his teeth, grew more and more enraged. Since the nobleman didn't want to lose his title or any of his limbs, he lowered his hand. Anna had completely changed. The foolish little girl who always begged for love was gone. All that remained was a crown princess who now stood above everyone in the empire. The man then began to sweat and told his daughter that he made a mistake because he was very upset that afternoon. He then asked how she could act so coldly toward her own father, but the maiden was even harsher and asked him to leave immediately and never show his face again at the crown prince's palace. She would forgive him this time, but if something like that happened again, there would be no mercy. The man called for Anna, shouted for the guards to release him, and begged his daughter to listen to him, but it was all in vain. The protagonist wanted nothing to do with such a detestable person. After all, the only reason for his visit was to threaten her for some kind of personal gain. Considering that the blonde was now very well regarded by the emperor, the girl didn't wish to see him ever again. However, since the day he was expelled from the palace, the Count continued sending her letters. Of course, the sweet princess didn't waste any time reading any of that worthless nonsense. Besides, she didn't have time to care about Balatian at that moment because she had started her dance lessons. As the prince's wife, it was her duty to be present at the sealing ceremony. The rituals of the ball were just rituals, but the hardest part for her was the dance itself. Her Highness couldn't control her feet very well, and the moment she confused her left foot with her right, she ended up tripping and sprawling on the floor. Her tutor, Melissa and Blake, were very distressed to see her lying on the hard floor, and they ran to ask if she was still okay. Even Yoonhan, disguised as a black cat, ran to her rescue. The girl was fine, but felt very embarrassed and wished to be left alone. Upon getting up, the princess said there was nothing to worry about, but the teacher thought it best to end the lessons for the day, and the young girl gladly accepted the suggestion. Anna was returning gloomily to her chambers when she noticed her little black kitten by a pillar. Her mood immediately improved, and she picked him up in her arms. The two had quite a deep conversation, with the animal giving lots of advice to the worried girl, although, of course, all she could hear were meows. But since the feline had made her feel better, she decided to give him another treat. While the little one licked the broth he was given, Blake returned from his training and approached his wife. The maiden then asked if he was learning many sword techniques with Knight Edom. The masked boy said yes, but soon became annoyed by the presence of the male animal. Blake's agitation increased by the second, and Yoonhan became more and more uncomfortable. The heir then stepped closer and said it didn't seem like a real cat. He said he had a strange feeling when he got near the creature, and at the moment he reached out his fingers to touch it, the cat leapt from the princess's arms and fled once again. Her husband didn't allow her to look for the feline and asked her not to waste her time with other males. He was already enough for her. Asking if the blonde liked cats more, the crown prince began making cat-like sounds and positioning his hands to imitate them. This made the protagonist tremble to her core. She had never met anyone so cute in her life. She then replied that it didn't matter what animal he pretended to be, she would love him as long as he was her husband. At that moment, she remembered she had a request to make to him, and before she could even say what it was, the young boy agreed to it. Blake said he would do anything for Anna, even strange things. So she held the little prince's hands and asked him to help her practice her dance steps. The protagonist wanted him to be her first partner in her first dance. He was delighted and said he would help her whenever she wanted. The lady planned to invite him once she got better at her skills. But 10 days had passed, and she hadn't improved at all. However, he didn't mind, even if she ended up stepping all over his feet, because he considered her a fairy, due to her character, temperament, and appearance. The boy looked at her so tenderly that the whole moment felt poetic. After a few seconds of enjoying each other's presence, Anna extended her hand and said it was time to start. The little boy blushed in embarrassment, but when asked if that was the reason, he furiously denied it. Their hands joined once again and the dance began. At first, everything went well, until Anna started stepping on her husband's feet several times. Also, she frequently lost the rhythm and bumped into her beloved. The protagonist became tearful, believing she would never be able to learn. But the young boy told her to go slowly because it was her first time, and encouraged her to keep trying. Blake was very good with his feet, and when asked how he reached that level, he said he learned everything just by observing the blonde's lessons. The young boy said the only things missing for the young lady to dance very well were to relax and let herself be led. The girl nodded and followed his advice. It didn't take long, and Anna was able to dance an almost complete waltz, all thanks to His Highness. Blake revealed that she didn't need to feel so pressured because His Majesty danced even better than he did, so everything would be fine in the end. Moreover, everyone would be too busy admiring his wife's beauty to pay attention to her steps. The girl then let out a cheerful laugh. The boy, still leaning on the balcony, said the moment would be so beautiful that people would surely fall in love with her. Blake also ardently wished to be able to watch that scene, so his wife consoled him, saying he would have permission to attend many banquets when he grew up. With a firm look, he agreed and said he would accompany Anna to all of them, and the lady replied she would wait for him until then. Days later, the princess brought a pot full of bibimbap to His Majesty. At first, the appearance of the dish didn't please him much. He even joked, saying she was very brave to try to assassinate the emperor so blatantly. According to the young lady, the food wasn't poisoned, but every assassin said the same thing. After tasting it, the sovereign admitted it was delicious, and she was very happy to know there were people in that world who loved spicy food as much as she did. Teotiste said there was no need to worry because he would never refuse his daughter-in-law's delicacies, but Anna reminded him that he had just called her dish poisonous, and His Majesty countered, stating that he would eat it even if that were the case. Hearing such words from the most powerful man in the kingdom was truly embarrassing. He was excessively enchanted by his new daughter, so she scolded him, saying that His Majesty couldn't get sick because it would upset Blake greatly. The monarch said he was grateful not to be despised by his son, even though he hadn't done anything useful for him. Anna continued her sermon, declaring that as the greatest light of the empire, the sovereign should prioritize his health, not only for the crown prince's sake, but for all his people. The young lady had learned from Colin that the emperor had stayed up all night, but the man didn't want to keep being lectured by a child and ordered her to finish eating. As thanks for that wonderful meal, Teotiste decided to give her a gift in return. The girl didn't want to accept it because she had already received too much. However, he didn't listen and said he would build a glass greenhouse at the Amoria Palace for her. The Crown Prince's palace was old and almost deserted. Despite being called Amoria, which means love, the garden was poorly maintained. When winter came, you couldn't find a single flower. That's why His Majesty decided he would cover the lake and build the greenhouse over it. The same lake where Anna had once almost lost her life. The girl said he didn't need to do all that for her. She had only fallen into the stream because she wasn't used to the terrain at that time. Such a mistake would never happen again. Teotiste declared that he couldn't allow a place that had once threatened his daughter-in-law to continue to exist. And these words were accompanied by a dark look. The blonde didn't know what to say anymore because the lake wasn't anyone's enemy, and the situation seemed quite exaggerated. But in the end, she let it go. Returning home, Anna informed Blake about the Emperor's plans for the garden. The boy was quite happy and thought it was a great idea. The little prince also held a lot of resentment toward the place that had almost taken his beloved. It was time to get rid of it completely. There would be no regret on the boy's part. In fact, if it depended only on his will, with his determination, he would destroy that stream immediately. It's in these moments that the resemblance between father and son becomes much clearer. The two were very excited about the construction because it would probably be a huge greenhouse. The little boy asked his wife what she would like to plant there, and he received a very unusual answer because Anna wished to plant cabbages. According to her, it was a vegetable from the Far East and essential for making kimchi, a very spicy food, but the protagonist's favorite. The blonde believed the boy wouldn't like the taste much, but he said he would definitely eat it. However, the crown princess recommended that he should only eat it when he was older. And when Blake insisted he was already quite grown, the lady pinched his cheeks firmly. The little prince's protests were very amusing to the maiden. Finally, the protagonist asked if there was any kind of flower he would like to plant there, and the boy said yes, roses. Blake was determined to ensure many red roses for his wife. Such flowers represented love and were always used for marriage proposals. The girl wondered if it was right to accept such gifts from him. On the morning of the banquet day, the girl woke up a little tired. She was nervous because it would be her first public appearance as the imperial princess. Her little bunny woke up next and asked if she was already leaving. The lady replied yes and said she would be back as soon as she could. Instead of showing sadness, Blake encouraged her, and he smiled brightly as if her happiness was his own. Even though she was the only one to receive gifts from the emperor, the only one to have etiquette lessons, and also the only guest from the castle at the banquet. When it came to his wife, the husband always smiled sweetly. He then wished her to have fun and let her go. Several experienced madams came to help her get ready. They placed beautiful pink ribbons in her blonde hair, did her nails, and chose the finest jewelry. Anna looked stunning. The work was so well done that the princess thanked them from the bottom of her heart and apologized for calling them so early in the morning. But the ladies replied that it had been a great honor, and they were certain the blonde would be the star of the banquet. As she descended the stairs, the young lady met her new father. The emperor was enchanted by her elegance. Everything seemed meticulously planned to make her shine. As soon as they met, His Majesty complimented her, and the young lady returned the kindness. Anna said there was something different about him that day, and it was called pure perfection. The man gave a playful smile and asked his daughter to stop joking. He then held the girl's hand and they headed to the ball. Upon arriving at the hall, the two stars were announced. Everyone greeted the great son of the empire, His Majesty the Emperor, and also the blessing of the kingdom, Her Highness the Crown Princess. The nobles bowed to show their respect, but among them was someone observing the protagonist without due courtesy. It was Richard, and Anna was very uncomfortable with that smile. However, the young lady laughed internally because if he wanted to become the center of attention, he would at least have to be as handsome as her beloved father-in-law, or as adorable as Blake. The sovereign, noticing the young lady's unusual expressions, asked what was happening. Anna then asked him to come closer and whispered in his ear that he was the most handsome among all the guests. The monarch laughed and said she wasn't very trustworthy. Since it was extremely rare for Teotiste to even smile, the nobles immediately started murmuring. They were all astonished by the affection the man showed his daughter-in-law, and the girl soon began to feel confused by the intense reaction, wondering what he was like when not in her company. Probably as serious as possible, because the moment the sovereign stopped smiling, the atmosphere immediately returned to being formal. The silence was deafening, as expected from the emperor who ruled an entire nation. Finally, the beginning of the ceremony was announced. The ambassadors remained respectfully bowed, and a beautiful golden chalice was handed to His Majesty. That day, all honor belonged to the goddess of light and the people. While Teotiste gave his speech, Anna remained quiet on her throne. She was a bit nervous because after the speech, he would call her for a dance and the ball would officially begin. This made her a little unhappy because the girl wished her first dance partner at an official event to be her little bunny husband. But she couldn't let herself be swayed by such feelings, as it would be very childish. However, the emperor declared to all the guests that the party would begin without the royal family's dance, since his own skill as a dancer was extremely tedious and outdated. The protagonist was surprised but also deeply grateful. Then, the son of the empire honored the goddess of light once more and asked the guests to enjoy the ceremony. When Teotiste sat on his throne, the princess asked why he had done that. Then the handsome man said he knew the girl's feelings and her wish to have Blake as her first partner. Although they hadn't spent much time together, the sovereign already understood the girl very well. Therefore, he decided he would wait for his second chance. And Anna thanked him sincerely and humbly. The young lady's good behavior was so endearing that the monarch placed his hand on her head, saying that he was the one who should be saying thank you. This contact brought a very comforting warmth to the girl, besides causing a new intense wave of murmurs. She wondered if she would have to endure that every time she appeared in public with her father-in-law. But since that was her first official appearance, Anna couldn't stay seated. So she went straight to the center of the hall and began to be bombarded by a series of compliments. The princess first spoke with Marquis Sheldon and congratulated him on having a son who had taken on the role of speaker at the Night Academy. Then she addressed Countess Marcion and commented that soon her daughter-in-law's baby would receive the blessing of the light. If there was anything more important than good manners at a banquet, it was remembering the names of all the nobles. Had the protagonist studied that hard in her past life, she surely would have gotten into the prestigious Harvard University. But that was just the basic knowledge an empress or crown princess needed to have. She had to be exemplary in imperial protocol, diplomatic strategy, and the political history of the empire. It wasn't enough to simply smile at banquets. She had to master the language of power. Glances, subtle smiles between advisors, small silent disputes at the table. Everything demanded a resilient and well-prepared mind. And on her debut in the elite social circles, she managed to greet everyone present without anyone's help, which was quite a feat, considering they hadn't yet invented the cameras we know today. That should have been enough for her to be more recognized. However, not everything was roses, since her biological father, Count Balatian, was present. He was, however, in the company of the blonde's younger sister, Diana. The girl, whose eyes were as clear as the clean northern sky, was exceptionally beautiful that day. Seeing her in person made the protagonist wonder about her well-being, but she didn't have much time to think, as she was soon interrupted by the Duke's son. Just being in his presence completely ruined her good mood. But Richard was shameless, and after complimenting her beauty, tried to invite her for a first dance. The veins in Anna's face began to pulse from the sheer rage she felt. It was hard to believe he was serious. The only ones who deserved the first dance with the princess were His Majesty and His Imperial Highness. Everyone else knew their place and merely came to greet her. But that idiot came brazenly up to her to make such a ridiculous request. The princess took a deep breath and firmly refused, but Richard, even more clueless, said it was fine if she didn't know how to dance properly. He would guide her very well. That made the young lady's lips tremble with fury, because even if it were true, saying such a thing in front of so many guests was a huge breach of courtesy. Thus, the young lady replied that she could never accept such a request if it didn't come from someone as handsome as His Majesty. Richard reacted with such a fierce expression that his beautiful features became useless. It would be hard to hide his true nature after such a humiliation. The ladies around respectfully laughed at Anna's words, for if she kept such high standards, she might spend her entire life waiting for a dance partner. The monarch was truly one of a kind in the world. The dark-haired man's plans were completely foiled. His words weren't enough to upset the princess, and in the end, he left with his pride wounded. Thus, the young man turned around and didn't show his face again that day. After chatting endlessly, Anna finally managed to find a moment for herself. While standing on one of the balconies, looking at the sky, the girl wondered what Blake was doing. It was the first time the two had been apart for so long. She was already missing her little bunny husband terribly. The blonde hoped from the bottom of her heart that he wasn't crying because of her. Then 2 knocks were heard, and a girl's voice asked if she could come in. Usually people avoided balconies with closed curtains, so that probably meant the other balconies were already full. Thus, the princess told her to come in. Behind the curtains was none other than her adorable sister, Diana. She had come to compliment her, saying that she looked breathtaking that day and resembled an angel. The little one said that the protagonist wasn't just beautiful, but magnificent, and wondered how anyone could be so dazzling. Anna thanked her for the compliments and was happy to see that Diana seemed cheerful. According to the original story, Diana was always attached to Anna. In the beginning, the older sister also adored her younger sister, but Count Balatian's favoritism slowly separated the 2 sisters. Every time Diana suggested she wanted to play with the current princess, the father would beat the older daughter. This continued until Anna couldn't take it anymore and decided to distance herself from Diana. From that moment on, they no longer played together. Because of this complicated relationship, the younger sister blamed herself for the older sister's death and carried that guilt until the day she died. Diana left home as soon as she became an adult. She chose to become Blake's servant to show her repentance. However, the overall context was now different. The real Anna was certainly gone, but Diana didn't know that. Then she would not carry any guilt for the rest of her life. Thus, after praising the princess's skill at conversing with others, she asked if she was in good health, to which the blonde replied that she was. Then, after checking that no one else was around, Diana handed her sister a small gift. It was inside a small brown box and was a heated cushion made from fire element mana stones. With it, Her Highness would always stay warm. She hadn't had the chance to deliver it before, and winter had already passed. But Anna told the little one not to worry because she was already completely recovered. Diana went on to say that she didn't need to worry about their father since she had bought the gift in secret with her own money, so there was no problem in accepting it. The princess thanked her and promised she would make good use of it. Diana's beautiful eyes welled up with tears, and her sister advised her that it wasn't very wise to start crying over such trivial matters. However, the little one was simply too happy to have finally delivered what she wanted. Thus, Her Highness lent her a beautiful handkerchief decorated with small roses. But Diana thanked her and said she could use her own handkerchief. Nevertheless, she didn't miss the chance to compliment her sister's little cloth as well, and she asked if it had been a gift from His Majesty. Anna said yes, and that only made the younger girl even happier. For now, she was certain the sovereign cared a lot about her relative. Diana was much more adorable and beautiful than in the original novel. At dusk, the crowned princess boarded her carriage and finally returned to her beloved's palace. As soon as she stepped down from the carriage, she was greeted by a strong hug from the little prince. It felt like a reunion after years apart. And once they met, it seemed as if all the burdens of the world disappeared. Finally, the maiden asked her husband what he thought of her outfit, and Blake replied that she looked magnificent, which made her smile and blush slightly. When they reached their room and lay on the bed, the blonde could finally breathe naturally. That was her refuge. And when the little one asked if she had enjoyed dancing with the emperor, the girl replied that no dance had occurred, for it was her deepest wish that her first dance at an official ball be with her own bunny husband. Blake remained silent for a while as Anna told him that His Majesty had respected her wish, but her husband wasn't very happy with the girl's choice. He believed she should have danced with the emperor, since he would hardly be able to attend ceremonies like that himself. The blonde asked why, and he replied, as always, that he was cursed. She then held the boy's hand and said he would surely be cured. Anna had already met the one who would lift the curse, and she was a beautiful and kind girl. Thus, she pulled His Highness even closer and asked him to make her a promise. The little prince asked what it was about, and the lady replied that she wanted him to promise that once the curse was lifted, he would dance with her before everyone. The girl's smile radiated the brightest hope. Blake took on a worried tone and agreed, asking with whom else he could possibly do such a thing besides his wife. The protagonist let out a slight sigh, but then the conversation took a completely different turn. The boy started to get scared, and it wasn't because of the curse's consequences. He was worried about the possibility of being abandoned by her. He thought about how terrible it would be to suddenly wake up one day and find she had left without saying a word. Even though she claimed she had no other place to go, Blake started to get agitated. He was shouting and begging not to be abandoned. He practically threw himself on her, crying that he would do anything to make her stay by his side. He wept so bitterly like never before. And then the blonde hugged him, asking him to stop lamenting. This time it was the little one who asked the princess to make a promise. They would be just words, but it was never easy to say such a lie. Blake begged her never to leave him, and with a heavy look, the girl promised she would always stay with him. Despite saying those words, she was mentally prepared to leave. The protagonist only wanted to comfort the crown prince, who was already traumatized by almost losing his fiancée. She wanted to protect him completely, but the only way to free Blake from so much suffering would be to let him fall in love with Diana, just as in the original story. If Richard was planning to monopolize little Diana, just like in the novel, Anna could only leave after completely destroying the boy's intentions. But the situation was far too bad. It seemed the heir to the throne liked the princess much more than she had initially thought. Her concern then grew much deeper. So she wrote a letter to her sister, allowing the two to meet much earlier than in the original. A few days later, the moment arrived when Diana would visit them. Everything was well organized in the palace, and His Imperial Highness was dressed in his new and beautiful blue and white suit. The little boy was a charm. He also seemed very nervous. After all, who wouldn't be anxious about meeting their first love? But in reality, he was only worried about the possibility of being disliked by his sister-in-law. Anna reassured him, saying everything would be fine, and straightened his tie. The princess didn't believe her husband had told the truth. She thought those words were merely a polite gesture in front of her. Although the meeting was happening earlier than expected, it was better sooner rather than later. The sky blended shades of blue and orange when the sister of His Crowned Highness arrived at the palace. She quickly stepped down from the carriage and went straight to hug her sister. She was completely dressed in lilac, which greatly enhanced her beautiful green eyes. For little Diana, being invited to Anna's home was like a dream come true. The girl was so anxious that she barely slept the night before. She acted like a little puppy, showering the protagonist with compliments. But first, Anna warned her that she should greet the crown prince. Diana then bowed politely and greeted the young boy. Blake was also very charmed to meet her, and they seemed to have great harmony. Anna's expression was pitiful, because, as expected, they looked more like a perfect couple than she had imagined. Soon, the protagonist excused herself, saying she would visit His Majesty for a moment. Then, she asked her husband to take the guest inside the palace and treat her with all possible courtesy. Blake accepted that responsibility with great pleasure. As she walked away, the princess thought it was done, and she shouldn't let her selfish feelings get in the way, because it was a good thing. Thus, she resignedly followed her path. If they fell in love in her absence, it would be for the greater good. That had been, after all, her intention when inviting her sister. Blake was growing more and more attached to Anna as the days passed, and that couldn't continue. Love requires sacrifices. For that reason, the protagonist was completely willing to give up her own happiness, even if it hurt a lot. And those weeks she had spent beside Blake were enough to create a whole collection of wonderful memories. And that's it for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed the story. I'm finding the characters extremely adorable, and I can't wait to see how their personalities will evolve as they grow up. Don't forget to tell me what you think in the comments. And if you want more, don't forget to like the video and subscribe so you won't miss any new videos I post. See you next time.